Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Resurface webinar on latest trends in API security. And for many of you, it might be an introductory webinar on API security. We have myself, Richard Stiennon. I'm Chief Research Analyst at IT Harvest, and I started researching API security about 18 months ago as a standalone category. And Rob Dickinson, who's co-founder of Resurface. So I'm here to talk about the industry. Rob is here to talk about the nitty gritty of API security because he understands it a lot better than I ever will. So let me bring in Rob. Welcome, Rob.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. My favorite topic.
Yeah, I'm sure. And it looks like you are joining us from a hotel, so you must be on the road.
I am. I'm in Sydney, Australia
Ah, lovely. Lovely.
this week, which
Yep.
has been amazing.
I bet it has. I bet it has. But it must be close to 9 o'clock there, and you're probably getting ready to crash. So we're going to dive into this. I know that's how I feel when I'm in Sydney. So let me kick off because over a year ago, I was, as an industry analyst, I was working with a vendor, and they asked me to, pull together a roundtable of CISOs. And so I reached out to about 100 CISOs over LinkedIn, and I got no takers for, a non-commercial, let's just talk about API security and what we're doing about it. So we tried that again this past January of 2022, and it took half an hour to get about 12 responses and put together a API security roundtable. So something happened last year where it got on people's radar. And I think if it's following the normal process, right? The way all security solutions come about and a category starts up is invariably there's a lot of attacks and breaches and pain resulting from those attacks. And then a lot of startups say, hey, we've got the solution, and start marketing against that. And eventually these security teams start recognizing that this is an attack vector that they have to worry about and start to create budget for it. And then they start the evaluation process. And that always takes time. So, when I first started looking at this, there might have been 4 or 5 vendors that I could find. And now we're at the tail end of 2022. We've had 3 full quarters, and I wanted to start with the entire industry. This is my first chance to present the data I collect in our dashboard on all 3,092 vendors that make up the security industry. This is worldwide, right? And we've all heard that, oh my gosh, the world's coming to an end, stock markets are way down, inflation's way up, spending's way up, there's a war, oh my gosh. This is the end of the security industry. There won't be any more investment. All the startups that are still working off of venture capital funds are not going to get any more. They've got to conserve their cash, cut back, stop hiring people, in some cases lay people off. So I was expecting or looking for some evidence that was happening. It doesn't exist. There are certainly very large vendors, with over 1,200 people who, weren't profitable yet, saw their, input from their investors and did indeed announce layoffs of 20 to 25%. Those are the outliers. Everybody else just keeps chugging along and probably taking advantage of the fact that experienced people are being laid off from other security vendors. So the industry as a whole is growing. This is something that I've been striving to be able to put together for years. Take all of the sectors of IT security, so identity, operations, network, GRC, endpoint, and track them separately so I can see what their health is, what they're growing, and someday I'll be able to turn that into revenue numbers and tell you exactly how big the market is for the space from a bottoms-up perspective. And the chart there is the data for all 17 subcategories, 17 categories that I track, sorted by how fast they're growing. Identity is hiring like mad. And I guess it should be no surprise, right? We're entering this cloud world, digital transformation, and identity is becoming a very, very important part of that. Investors are interested in it because they hear the zero trust story, so they jump into it. So great, identity with, probably a total of 1 million employees at all these vendors, is yet it's growing, and it's taken in some capital in the third quarter. But what popped up last year was API security. Last year, API security grew 60% in headcount. So that's, new vendors getting funded and hiring people, existing vendors, for the most, some of them doubling in size easily last year. So checking in on them for a quarter's growth, they grew 6% in the third quarter. And it's so far they're tracking about 35% growth so far this year. So they'll probably end up, of the 28 vendors that I track in that category, these are API security specific vendors. They message around it. They've got solutions around it. So they're not the big, big companies that have one of everything, adding or making an acquisition of a small vendor and going to market with API security. Not saying that those might not be good solutions, just that you can't track their headcount growth, so you don't know how fast they're growing. Of course, you can't take data from the vendors themselves because they'll always shade it in such a way that they look as good as they can. So all in, the cybersecurity industry so far this year has taken in $15 billion in venture capital. That doesn't sound like a recession of any sort. Doesn't sound like the VCs are expecting a recession. I think we are just on track to, we're already way on track to exceed 2020's investments, which were 10 billion. So we're 60% over 2020. We could end the year at 18 billion. Sure, that's less than the 26 billion that came in last year. Last year was the peak. There's no way around that. So when I look at the 28 API security specific companies, of course, a lot of them have taken in a whole bunch of money. The total funding, for the no names and salts are way up there, over 200 million. Sequence is at a paltry $100 million in funding, and Gravity.io, a French company, is taken in 41 million. So lots and lots of investment going into the space, but also some pretty good growth in the quarter, with the French contender here growing the fastest in a quarter, but others growing quickly as well. And I mentioned, the drivers for an industry are the attacks. And you got to admit, even the huge space of cloud security, most of the attacks in cloud security that have gotten press have involved API attacks. Usually it's very simple, right? Somebody, made available their secrets to get access to the APIs by publishing them in GitHub, for instance, right? So kind of lame stuff. But obviously, once the attackers realize the power of compromising the APIs, they're going to get more and more sophisticated. And APIs have a tremendous attack surface, right? So many ways that they're implemented could be attacked by a knowledgeable hacker. And that's why we're going to be talking to Rob about, what those attacks are and, how this all breaks down. So, Rob, my first question is, why are there so many vendors?
Well, obviously it's a new space, and that's part of it. But I think the bigger answer is that there are multiple definitions of what API security means today. There's multiple kinds of tools that one needs to deploy to get your hands around API security. And that's not a completely new message, right? I mean,
Mhm.
security has always taken a layered approach. There's always been multiple kinds of solutions that you need. It's funny because 10 years ago when I going to O'Reilly conferences about DevOps, there was this kind of ongoing joke about where can I get DevOps in a box? They would even show this on stage at times, like here's the box and it's got DevOps on it. And wouldn't it be nice if you could just go buy DevOps in a box? You're not really buying DevOps in a box. You're buying into GitHub, you're buying into CI/CD, you're buying into kind of a constellation of ideas propped up by tools in different, from different vendors that are really expressing that DevOps idea. I think we're seeing the same thing here. So it's about having an API savvy version of your firewall. It's an API version savvy testing, a pen testing perspective, API specific monitoring. Going API first does present new requirements. Some of those things are, some of those security practices are relatively familiar and relatively comfortable. You need to do vulnerability scanning on your code, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But other aspects of that, particularly around authentication, user management, and runtime monitoring, are where your needs are going to end up looking, somewhat different than what you had before. But it's funny how many of the conversations that I have, it even starts with an awareness of what is an API. Why does that matter? Why are we talking about it? Almost every conversation I have starts there, really.
Yeah.
And not everyone has that shared understanding.
Sure. Well, let's talk about that. I was thinking this morning how, as an industry analyst who covers cybersecurity, I don't learn about any of the new technology until security vendors start telling me about how they're protecting it. Right. That's how I first learned about, security for VMs and containers, because I'm not a developer. But I remember back in the day, every single security vendor would talk to me about their SDK. So if you had a SIM and you wanted to integrate something else with the SIM, your trouble ticketing system, they'd say, "Oh, easy. We'll give you an SDK, and your developers will figure out all the hooks to make it work." And gosh, 7, 8 years ago, I stopped hearing. I haven't heard that term in that long, right? Because the answer is all immediately API. Because wow, is it easy to basically publish an API and make it available, and it's always, go to this website, put this information in, and we'll generate the secure key. And I'm scratching my head and go, wait, you're giving me a password, no username, just a single password. You'll never know who used that API key except on the back end. That doesn't sound right to me. There's no, as far as I know, there's no handshake. There's no encryption going on, in these standard API integrations. It just seems rife for these problems.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think it's fair to say that APIs are a fundamental way of shifting your locus of control. I mean, so much about this is you're saying, I'm going to have this API. It's open. Ideally, it's open to a much larger audience than I had before,
Mm-hmm.
and also relaxing the idea of having any kind of trusted client. So I think that's one of the ways to kind of see the how this is unfolding is we went from a place where we conducted a lot of our business through websites and kind of email directed flows or web form directed flows. We moved from that to mobile applications where API was kind of hidden behind that one trusted client of the mobile app. But then you see vendors like the Twilios and the SendGrids of the world are kind of the easy examples here, where literally their API is their entire business. There's no sense of a trusted client at all. It's whoever wants to show up and use that interface from whatever kind of software platform you want to do. So, I mean, in some sense, it's wonderful and empowering, right? Because you're able to provide your services as really any kind of automated broker to anyone that wants to consume those. But from a security perspective, you're losing one of your best holds was what you could enforce on the client side, and basically all of that is gone now.
Right. Right.
Um, and that's a huge change. And I think the other thing, about this fundamentally is those web assets were something that any the company could go and see. That anybody from the CEO on down, they could go to the website, they could fill out one of those forms. Did it work? Did I
Right.
get the right mail in the end of it? It was very democratizing and empowering in that way. And that's an area where we've taken a step backwards with APIs. APIs are very powerful for the people who are technical enough to be able to consume them. But because they're that technical, they're dark for most people in the organization.
Sure.
Most people in the org don't understand how to take Insomnia and poke those APIs, or use the developer docs and write their own scripts to exercise those APIs and really get their own sense of it. Your own tactile sense of what those things are, and how they work.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
I think that in itself is a huge problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel that now because, as you know, I'm developing a web app and we have APIs all over the place. And it's no code, right? So none of us are coding anything at all. But luckily, my developer is security conscious, and he's looking at the platform and he says, "Wow, I can just open the web developer toolkit inside Chrome browser, and I can see the API keys." And somebody could just use that and just get direct access to the data we're trying to sell. So we can't have a free account where that's limited or something like that. So we had went through a major shift to move. Our solution was just move it to a more secure platform that's doing stuff like that and limiting API access, which is double authentication, etc. So, what was the trigger for you when what made you go, "Wow, this is a big problem. I've got to build the technology and start a company to address it"?
Well, my previous company, we were doing web observability. So we were really, recording web traffic, shopping cart kind of activity, focusing on revenue generating applications. And I mean, we saw the writing on the wall years ago that we were seeing more and more customers that were using that technology to monitor their SOAP APIs or REST APIs. Um, even going back, years now. That's something that we saw come on, very quickly. And really so we launched Resurface in 2019, and in 2019, a lot of our conversations were, what is an API? I'm not sure I have one. Um, I'm not sure what I need, what I need to be doing, what I need to be thinking about. Um, to now, it's something that's very much in the news. I mean, part of why I'm down here in Australia is there's a huge hack here, out of the largest Australia telecom, that resulted in a data leak of over 10 million subscribers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that was through an API that was accidentally exposed without any kind of authentication mechanism. Um, that's a simple mistake, right? It's an
Yeah,
easy mistake to make.
very
Um,
easy.
you know, and you only have to make that mistake one time.
Mm-hmm.
And that, anyone in security will tell you that's a big part of the challenge is you have to be right all the time. Your attacker only has to get lucky once.
Right, right. And isn't it seems over time that breaches occur so often through misconfigurations and just doing things wrong. But the attacker universe includes your employees, your users, your customers, because at one of those customers, even though the business person isn't going to use tools against you or dig in, there will be a curious person that is in the broader term hacker, right? They want to know how things work. So they'll start poking around and they'll go, "Hey, what's this? It's the access key right there. And I'm all set." Um, and I get the feeling that the malicious attackers are reading the news as well and starting to poke around more. They probably already have the technical skills, anyways, but now they're looking for API vulnerabilities, for lack of a better term. API misdeployments would be maybe a better term, and finding them and then seeing what they can do. Just like people scan Amazon S3 buckets for interesting data. And luckily, more researchers and attackers do that, but it's still very embarrassing when all of your data is exposed. And you have to kind of say we're a breach, but it's not really a breach.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you see that going on now?
So I think the you know, and I try to be doom and gloom about. I mean, I think there's a tremendous amount of promise and positive, positive energy around APIs. Um, but the reality is where these APIs are being deployed are into these hostile public network environments. When you deploy something onto a public cloud, and it doesn't really matter which cloud, by the way. You're putting your API and your application into a known address space
Mm-hmm.
that people are scanning all the time. There's nothing private about that. um, you are very, very, very publicly exposed by doing that. Um, that puts you in a place where those attackers basically show up immediately. We've run our own honeypot applications in different cloud environments. We see attackers show up within about 30 minutes on average.
Wow.
And
Wow.
they're banging away on those applications for the entire time that they are reachable. So it's not, when you reach some level of success or when you reach some level of notoriety, that those bad folks will show up. They'll show up, before your paying customers in
Right.
some
Right.
regards. I think the other thing that you touched on is there's also now a much wider range of capabilities and skill sets in this hack community, right? We've moved from, you know, a sophisticated hacker attack back in the day was I'm going to port scan for all unsecured SQL Server instances in an IP address range, and I'll go after those databases, right? And the people running those scripts maybe couldn't have even written the script to begin with, right?
Right. Right.
We've really moved from that to a place where the worst attackers that we're seeing at the application level, they're impersonating users, they're taking over user accounts, they are signed up as paying customers, even in cases where there's know your customer laws, where you think that might help, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are still ways around all of these mechanisms, as it turns out, and there's a level of sophistication, and I also think a level of revenue that these folks are generating. I wish someone could give me a number on what the total dark, revenue is
Yeah.
around these things. But we know it's enabled by crypto, right? And we know that crypto payments around malware and ransomware and all those things are skyrocketing.
Yep.
So this is, these attacks are lucrative. They're not that expensive to carry out, and they're increasingly being carried out by a more and more sophisticated set of attackers.
Right.
Of course, you're going to see just a bunch of script kiddies show up, but that's not really, I don't think, the nightmare scenario to worry about anymore. The nightmare scenario is really, an attacker signs up as a paying customer, and they go right through your firewall. When they do that, they go right through your authentication layer and right to some kind of privilege escalation attack from their valid account else's.
Right.
And those are things that are, those are hard to find.
Yeah. 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 So let's talk a little about Resurface's approach. And one point I want to make is the in the world of application security, a lot of the solutions are focused on you developers have just got to do a better job. You got to check form field inputs. You got to do all these things. Look at the OWASP top 10. And it's your fault and your responsibility. So add a whole bunch of work to what you do just to get a product out there and working. And it appears to me that API security, one, will help you discover stuff, but is starting to get to the point where you can not rely on changing your development process and adding expense and friction and slowing down development, and still protect your applications and their access. So let me bring up your slide, which is right here. So talk us through this approach, I guess.
Yeah, so as I said, there's a number of different kinds of security products for API security specifically on the market today. And what we're really focused on with Resurface is runtime monitoring. So a lot of the folks that we talk to, they already have a solution in place for vulnerability scanning, code scanning, container scanning. Most of the folks that we talk to, they already have a firewall, where that's a traditional firewall or a WAF. And those are obviously, good places to start. Where we see folks that are missing the most is really having actionable telemetry on what their APIs are really doing. So how often are they being attacked? How often are they being used successfully? And as a developer myself, what I really want to understand my runtime environment is really, what were all the inputs, what were all the outputs? Did the system do the right thing that I wanted to have happen in all those cases? As you mentioned, a lot of these security issues are right at the intersection between quality and configuration and correctness. And then right on the other side of that is the obvious malicious attack. But that really goes, that ultimately all gets lumped together. So we talk about this in terms of these pillars, where in terms of runtime monitoring, you want to be able to discover the APIs that you have, discover what that traffic looks like, to be able to score that traffic, then moving to be able to detect certain kinds of issues, having out-of-the-box coverage for things like the OWASP top 10, and then basically being able to set up resolutions or remediations, responses to different kinds of events happening with your APIs then. So what we want to be able to move towards is not just say that when something happens, let's block that attacker at the firewall. Like that's a very specific action that a lot of the firewall vendors implement. But that's a pretty narrow range in terms of all the different ways that the organization could respond to a particular event. Maybe you want to block them at the firewall. Maybe you want to force a password reset, or you want to force, some kind of account level reset, or maybe you want to signal the development team that something needs to be done. Those are all meaningful actions for the organization to take. So that's really what we're doing with Resurface in a nutshell. We're capturing this traffic. We're helping people inventory, understand the APIs that you actually have, and then to very easily be able to set policies and automated workflows so that when a particular kind of event happens on your API, you're triggering the right kind of response from the organization. Because at the end of the day, everybody's trying to do this faster. The dev test release cycles are getting shorter and shorter. And so having more automated process on top of that is really a good way to deal with that constraint.
Yeah, I've seen some fallover into the API testing, which comes out of the software app testing. side of things to make sure the API is returning or uh, doing the right thing and returning the right data. If there's a stack of of the API ecosystem, assume the application is in it, and then the API endpoint, right, and the API gateway, and then whatever's consuming, creating requests or calls. Tell me about these API gateways. Are they a choke point for traffic? Are they hardware appliances? Where do they sit?
Yeah, the role that we see the gateways play is very important for the folks who are using them. You know, especially if you have a large number of APIs and you're trying to bring that together into a single catalog, and you're trying to you're trying to standardize their usage and their routing and their authentication. The API gateways are great for that. And there's some newer ones like Tyke, for example, TYK, that you can get into very, very easily. It's not super expensive to get into. Historically, as API management has tended to have dollar costs associated with it, not just because of the tools, but because of the switching costs. You usually have to revamp your APIs to use those,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be very expensive. Um, but one of the problems with APIs is a lot of the folks that we talk to, they have a huge number of them. It's not uncommon to have hundreds, if not thousands, of APIs, and certainly if you're in that category, then anything that helps deal with that complexity is good, and that's where really the API management comes into it. Um, Now those vendors, they will they offer monitoring and observability as kind of a check the box kind of a feature. So they do have some capabilities in those areas. We feel like we go way beyond that, because we're providing true standards-based data lake. It's not just a set of reports based on URLs and response codes. We also get really deep into specific API technologies. We have knowledge of REST, knowledge of GraphQL, knowledge of JSON, that's built into our platform. So again, if you're really focusing on application layer behaviors and application layer attacks, you need to be as specific to the API technology set as possible.
Got it. Well, let's talk about, yeah, you're so good. You only had the one slide. Um, so it seems like I can just imagine an API gateway um, owned or managed completely by a single retailer. Let's pick Target or something. Um, Probably a pretty good place to get credit card information from during the day after Thanksgiving, right? Millions and millions of transactions just going through, or a big e-commerce site, same thing. And maybe it's the Stripes and Squares of the world with their API gateways, but it seems like they're really painting a target, literally, on their systems. Do you Have we seen any of those types of attacks?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. And I think one thing that you have to acknowledge is, it's so rare just to have one or two APIs. I mean, there is a large fan out associated with this. So if you're talking to if you're talking to an organization of any size, there probably are not just one development team, but there's multiple development teams. Each of those development teams is looking after a unique set of those microservices on the back end, and each one of those has an API. So this is something that we just see over and over and over again. it's not just that you have the relationship between the AppSec team and the development team. It's you actually have multiple AppSec teams. You have multiple development teams, all operating in their own swim lanes, right? So, that you're talking about, you probably have like a payment integration team and a set of web service, set of API services around that wrap your Stripe integration, on your end and put the business rules you want over top of it. And then you'll have other services specific to signing up users or areas of functionality that will end up using that payment gateway essentially that you have internally. So that's part of how you get to this multiple swim lane problem almost right away. It's one of the things that's great about microservices is you can say we'll break all this stuff down and we can attach different assets in terms of development and testing and security to look after those things, and those things can vary as much as they need to. As much as that's a positive thing, that's also very complex from a security perspective. It means it's a much more diverse environment, and it has that separation between those swim lanes that you have to deal with, almost right away.
Right. So
So
let's talk about the complexity and when, yeah, and specifically for Resurface, what's the deployment process look like? How intrusive to some of these existing processes and teams is it? Is it a heavy lift? Do they have to schedule it and plan it for 6 months before implementing? How's all that play out usually?
so Resurface is unique in the market today because we have really focused on first party deployments, and we're working with, our pipeline of customers are customers where they are very, very concerned about where this data goes. And unfortunately, right now, a lot of the competitors that you had on that slide earlier,
Mm-hmm.
they are SaaS-based products. And so the first thing that you're doing basically is you're mirroring all of your API traffic to their as a way to feed them that data so that they can give you back those insights and help focus on what you need to be focusing on. But the customers that we're working with, that's the first question they ask. If you're in healthcare, you're in financial services, you're in government, you're in banking, where your data goes, where that data lives, who has access to it is super, super important. There's also a bit of a geographical or cultural component here. If you're in Silicon Valley, this maybe doesn't matter as much. Like you may
Mm-hmm.
just say, well, we'll just ship our data wherever it needs to be,
Right.
and that's where, that's going to be fine.
Yep.
Um,
We
but
only
if you're
use China for data processing because Alibaba is
right,
better than the other clouds.
right, but if you're in Europe, if you're in APAC, if you're in Australia, where that data is resident and where it lives is super, super important. So we've actually taken the approach that we want to do that data collection in the customer's environment. So rather than sending all that data, Resurface and paying with your data, instead, we just give you the Docker containers and the Kubernetes that we would have run for you. That's
Mm-hmm.
what we were building our SaaS based on,
Right.
back when we first got started. We'll give you those same components. And basically, we just had a number of customers that said that. They said, hey, it's getting harder every year to do this third-party data transfer. There's also the transfer fees associated with that. But it's easier than ever before to run my own Docker container wherever I want it. The other thing that's really interesting about this is even for the folks who are SaaS-based, the salts and the no names and the traceables, you still have to install data collection agents onto your networks and onto your applications to send that data over to them. So you don't get the full benefit of a SaaS in that normal sense, right? Where can I just sign up in 5 minutes? I'm already done and it's implemented and I'm seeing the
Yep.
value in the solution, right?
Right.
You still have to basically instrument your apps or put those data action agents on your network. And so it's not quite as typical as a SaaS deployment from that perspective. Um, so our feeling is just, that, especially with that being the reality, it ends up being much better just and provision the database there locally as well. Um, and then that puts our customers in a place where you now have a local data lake that's based on open source, based on open standards. All that data is available. You can now bring that into other kinds of BI processing, ETL processing, or data science that you want to do on your own. And I think that's a pretty fabulous way to think about that customer relationship.
Yeah, that's great. And they get a dashboard that you provide that will show them what they're seeing, basically, and then they can go
Yeah.
beyond that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the really fun part about that is that with a with a a typical SaaS solution, sending over all your data, and then you're immediately subject to caps and limits
Mm-hmm.
about accessing your own data, which kind of rankles me a little bit.
Yep.
Because what that really means is that you're beholden to that vendor, that any processing of that data you're going to need is going to have to come to that vendor, right?
Right.
And
Right.
I hate those vendor conversations where you have a good idea and the vendor says, "Oh, that's a great idea. Well, we could build something like that at some point on our roadmap." It's like,
Right.
of course, and we're all developers. That's what we do. We write new stuff.
Right. Yep.
um, but that's very different than saying, um, here's a data lake that's in your environment. You can select star on all that data if you want to. You can roll through all that data if you want to. There's no caps, there's no limitations. We'll provide you a UI, we'll provide you this set of tools. But if there's something that you want to do that you can't express tools, let's jump down to a SQL interface, or let's grab a data notebooking tool, or whatever you want to do, and let's chomp through that data and get the problem solved. Um, I just think that's so being able to take that more standards based approach where you assume that you have that kind of capability against the data, I think shifts how you really think about using that telemetry and what those integration possibilities really look like. It's very different than, I'm going to send all my data to Salt, and if I'm really not satisfied with the result, I'm going to have to move to some other vendor. And I have a very limited role that I can play kind of in my success there.
Yep. Love it. Love it. Well, Rob, this has been great as I expected all along. I learned a lot. Um, I really appreciate that. We've got time to take some questions if you want to type them into the Bright Talk. Just hit the question mark over on the right on your panel. I'd love to hear what people are wondering. While we were talking, we did get a couple of questions. One of them looks like it's targeted at me because it's the question that comes up very often for me. Paraphrasing here, uh, is API security a standalone segment, right? So, in answer to that, I go, well, no, it definitely fits underneath application security, right? Say, because buying centers very, very close to the application security buying center because it's the devs that are looking at it. Some overlap and trickling over into the security teams. And many organizations have application security teams that are separate from the developers. Um, so I broke it out as a separate category to make it easier to track as a separate category. So I could show this tremendous growth based on headcount, mind you, for the industry and track the investments for the industry. And I could have done that with tags within application security. And the other question I always get alongside that is, yeah, but shouldn't I just go to my current WAF vendor or my current CICD security vendor who are telling me that they can do this as well? And it'd be great to have you chime in on that, Rob. Kind of get your perspective. Is it something that will be rolled up into all-in-one solutions? Just go to your existing vendor, which someday is going to be Cisco, because they're trying to own everything. But there are other big vendors that try and do everything. Fortinet, F5 in the application security space, Imperva. Um, will we mature to that point? In other words, will all the point solutions, if you want to call it that, be acquired? I know this is a question for an analyst, but I'd love to get your take on it.
Well, I certainly think that's going to be the trend over time. I mean, I think, there's a lot of precedent, obvious precedent around, you have a lot more vendors early on in the maturity of a market than you do, at the tail end.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some real challenges though around how much consolidation can happen, in any one portfolio. Just because part of what you get to is that you get into different user communities here and different buyer communities. If you're talking about vulnerability scanning, code scanning or package scanning, container scanning, for example, that's really dev team activity. If you're talking about runtime monitoring, that tends to be more of a security team kind of activity. So I think that's ultimately going to be a challenge for vendors that want to build that larger portfolio, right? Is the obvious implication there is now you're going to need salespeople that know how to talk to both of those communities when those communities have very different drivers. So I think ultimately, that's going to be a test for those vendors of how much of that they want to take on. Um, you know, is it going to be like the O'Reilly joke where everybody's looking for API security in a box
Right.
and looking to write one check? I mean, of course, from the business side, that's the best. That's the best outcome,
Yeah.
right? Having one throat to choke. Um, but I think it's going to take a long time to get there. If we ever do.
Yeah. Great insights, Rob. This has been so good. We'll give our viewers an opportunity to get part of their hour back. And I look forward to talking to you again. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.